The meeting chamber of the Galactic Council was a grand hall, filled with the representatives of species spanning hundreds of worlds, each one seated in a throne-like chair designed to suit their unique physiologies. The room buzzed with the muted hum of alien conversations in various languages, echoing the quiet authority of centuries of cosmic governance. At the center, standing with uncomfortable formality, were the representatives of Earth, human diplomats, military leaders, and scientists, all nervously awaiting their turn before the council. To the untrained eye, the humans appeared almost out of place. Dressed in simple, albeit sharp, uniforms and clutching an assortment of data pads, they seemed small and fragile compared to the towering forms of the insectoid Horthan or the psychic Phyrexians. Humanity had come a long way. True, surviving a violent, war-torn history to finally reach the stars. But even Earth's brightest knew that here, they were not respected. They had been invited to this meeting to be observed, to be tested, and in the minds of the council members, perhaps even to be dismissed. Humanity's official introduction into galactic politics had been long anticipated. The council had observed Earth's technological progress for decades, making sure the human race was kept under watch, while offering their most basic technology in exchange for compliance. No one in the council thought much of humans beyond their technological advancements. They were seen as little more than a potential asset for trade, no more important than a farmed species, valuable but easily replaceable. The Earth representatives, however, were far from naive. They had been raised in a world that prized survival, ingenuity, and grit. The meeting began with formal pleasantries, the council leaders presenting their respective species' achievements and influence. The human delegation remained quiet, listening intently. When Earth's representative, Ambassador John Hayes, was finally called upon to speak, he stepped forward with quiet confidence. "We come to you as equals," he said, his voice carrying with it the weight of the moment, not as supplicants. "Humanity has fought and bled for every inch of progress. We do not seek to be part of your galaxy for your benefit. We seek only peace and cooperation, on our own terms." The room fell silent. The words were simple, but Hayes' tone, utterly free of fear, of awe, struck a chord in the council chamber. For a moment, it seemed as though the humans might have had a chance to stand as equals. But the silence was quickly shattered by the laughter of the supreme representative, a Phyrexian elder whose immense psychic power projected an aura of superiority. "Your species is naive," the Phyrexian intoned, its voice both a whisper and a shout. "Your advancements are impressive, but we are the builders of the galaxy. We have seen countless races like yours rise and fall. You have yet to experience the true cost of galactic ambition. You may think yourselves ready, but you are merely children in a universe that knows no mercy." The words were spoken with a chilling calmness, but they weren't new to the humans. They had known they'd face condescension from the moment they entered the hall. Still, Ambassador Hayes stood firm, his face impassive. "We understand," he replied, "but we are not like the others. We do not bend to fate. We make our own destiny." Another representative, a towering Horthan with segmented limbs and a mandible-filled mouth, snorted derisively. "We shall see," it said. "The council will allow you time to prove yourselves, but do not mistake our tolerance for approval. You are no different than the countless species that have come before you. You will conform, or you will fade." Hayes' eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He knew this would be the pattern. Appeals for humanity's place in the stars would be met with dismissive arrogance. He had expected it, and he had prepared for it. What they didn't know, what none of the council knew, was that humanity's greatest asset had always been their capacity to adapt, to evolve, to rise in the face of adversity. It was a quality the council had failed to recognize. The session continued with formalities, the humans offering their technology for exchange, the council offering vague promises of support. But beneath the surface, there was a subtle tension building. Hayes knew something the council did not. There was a threat rising in the galaxy, one that had gone unnoticed by the galaxy's oldest and most powerful members. The Zathrians. The Zathrians had been a rumor, a shadow in the galaxy's outskirts, spoken of only in whispers. Their psychic powers, their brutal mind control. No one had yet dared confront them. The Council was aware of the threat, but they had dismissed it as a future concern. The Council believed they were invulnerable, that their collective power would ensure their safety. What they didn't realize was that the Zathrians were already watching, and they were coming for Earth. Hayes had seen the signs. He had been following intelligence reports, piecing together fragments of intercepted transmissions and anomalous data. The Council was blind to it, convinced that their vast experience and power made them untouchable. The humans, on the other hand, knew better. They had fought wars of their own, some of which they barely survived. They were ready for the worst, and when the worst came, the Council would learn that humanity was more than just another species to be absorbed. They would learn that humanity was the one species that could never be underestimated. By the time the full scale of the Zathrian threat was undeniable, humanity had already begun to organize behind the scenes. What began as small, covert groups of military officers and rogue scientists quickly turned into something far larger, a resistance movement. And the first rallying cry for humanity's defiance was clear. Earth would not fall without a fight. Ambassador Hayes, having anticipated the Council's hesitation, had worked in the shadows to form alliances with the more independent-minded species in the galaxy. These were species who, like humans, had been pushed to the fringes of galactic politics, ignored or oppressed by the Council. The Vecnari, a race of highly adaptable, genetically engineered warriors, were among the first to lend their support. They had long suffered under the Council's rule, their people used as pawns in the larger political games. Now they saw humanity's determination as the spark they had been waiting for. Soon after, a number of disillusioned Council members, primarily from species that had been left powerless by the Council's bureaucracy, began to secretly provide intelligence to the growing resistance. Human ingenuity became the foundation of this movement. While the Council focused on advanced but traditional warfare technologies, ships, weapons, and defenses, humans focused on something else: innovation. Small teams of human engineers, hackers, and spies worked relentlessly to uncover the Zathrians' weaknesses, both technological and psychic. They knew the enemy was powerful, but they also knew that no species, however advanced, could account for every variable. And humanity was a species that thrived on unpredictability. One of the first victories came when the Resistance infiltrated a Zathrian-controlled space station orbiting a distant mining colony. Using a combination of old-fashioned stealth technology and cutting-edge hacking techniques, a team of human operatives managed to breach the station's security systems. They didn't engage in direct combat. They didn't need to. Instead, they focused on sowing confusion and fear among the Zathrian forces. With a series of timed attacks on the station's communication systems, they sent false orders, redirected supply chains, and caused the Zathrians to turn on each other. The resulting chaos allowed the human team to gather vital intelligence about the Zathrians' tactics, their movement patterns, and even their psychic vulnerabilities. But it wasn't just technological sabotage that defined humanity's approach. It was their ability to think like their enemies. While the Zathrians were methodical and driven by their psychic hive mind, humans had an edge: their chaotic, individualistic nature. This unpredictability became a powerful weapon in itself. Zathrians were used to dealing with species that adhered to predictable patterns. Humans, on the other hand, acted without warning, without rhyme or reason, and it drove the Zathrians to the brink of madness. Meanwhile, the public face of the human resistance remained largely invisible. They had learned the hard way not to rely on any one centralized organization, especially in a galaxy where betrayal was common. Instead, human leaders worked independently, small cells scattered across the galaxy, each operating with its own agenda but united by the same cause: survival. At the same time, they continued to search for more allies, reaching out to species who had similarly suffered under the Zathrians' influence. The former slaves of the Aquari, a race of aquatic beings, were among the next to join the movement. Their intimate knowledge of subterranean and oceanic environments provided a significant advantage in attacking Zathrian strongholds that were otherwise impenetrable. The Zathrians, by now, had begun to realize they had underestimated humanity. Their psychic dominance had been their greatest weapon. And yet humans, lacking any innate psychic abilities, had found ways to shield themselves, to block their control. It was as if humanity's very nature was the antithesis of the Zathrians' hive-like mentality. Their inability to form mental connections made them immune to the Zathrians' psychic influence, forcing the invaders to resort to more traditional means of warfare. In one particularly daring operation, human forces managed to infiltrate the heart of a Zathrian psychic nexus, a powerful facility where the Zathrians enhanced their mental influence over other species. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by psychic dampening fields that neutralized the powers of any non-Zathrian species. Yet the humans didn't rely on brute force. Instead, they used their newfound understanding of Zathrian technology, their knowledge of the psyche, and the element of surprise. The operation was a success. The team not only destroyed the psychic nexus, but also acquired key data on the Zathrian mind control process, which was later reverse-engineered to develop human countermeasures. This was the turning point, the first true blow struck against the Zathrian forces. For the first time in months, humanity felt a glimmer of hope. But this victory came at a cost. The resistance had now become known to the Zathrians, and the invaders retaliated swiftly and violently. They began hunting down human colonies with renewed fervor, knowing that if they couldn't crush this movement, their conquest of the galaxy would never be complete. They unleashed their most terrifying weapons, advanced psychic agents capable of entering human minds with terrifying precision. As the resistance's momentum built, humanity understood the stakes were no longer about winning small battles. This was a war of survival, one that would define whether or not Earth's light would burn out in the cold void of space. But with each passing day, humanity grew bolder, more united, and more capable of meeting the Zathrians on their terms. The resistance was no longer just a group of desperate outliers. They were a force that could challenge the very fabric of galactic dominance. And the Zathrians were about to learn just how wrong they were about humanity. By the time the full scale of the Zathrian threat was undeniable, humanity had already begun to organize behind the scenes. What began as small, covert groups of military officers and rogue scientists quickly turned into something far larger, a resistance movement. And the first rallying cry for humanity's defiance was clear. Earth would not fall without a fight. Ambassador Hayes, having anticipated the Council's hesitation, had worked in the shadows to form alliances with the more independent-minded species in the galaxy. These were species who, like humans, had been pushed to the fringes of galactic politics, ignored or oppressed by the Council. The Vecnari, a race of highly adaptable, genetically engineered warriors, were among the first to lend their support. They had long suffered under the Council's rule, their people used as pawns in the larger political games. Now they saw humanity's determination as the spark they had been waiting for. Soon after, a number of disillusioned Council members, primarily from species that had been left powerless by the Council's bureaucracy, began to secretly provide intelligence to the growing resistance. Human ingenuity became the foundation of this movement, while the Council focused on advanced but traditional warfare technologies, ships, weapons, and defenses. Humans focused on something else: innovation. Small teams of human engineers, hackers, and spies worked relentlessly to uncover the Zathrians' weaknesses, both technological and psychic. They knew the enemy was powerful, but they also knew that no species, however advanced, could account for every variable, and humanity was a species that thrived on unpredictability. One of the first victories came when the resistance infiltrated a Zathrian-controlled space station orbiting a distant mining colony. Using a combination of old-fashioned stealth technology and cutting-edge hacking techniques, a team of human operatives managed to breach the station's security systems. They didn't engage in direct combat. They didn't need to. Instead, they focused on sowing confusion and fear among the Zathrian forces. With a series of timed attacks on the station's communication systems, they sent false orders, redirected supply chains, and caused the Zathrians to turn on each other. The resulting chaos allowed the human team to gather vital intelligence about the Zathrians' tactics, their movement patterns, and even their psychic vulnerabilities. But it wasn't just technological sabotage that defined humanity's approach. It was their ability to think like their enemies. While the Zathrians were methodical and driven by their psychic hive mind, humans had an edge: their chaotic, individualistic nature. This unpredictability became a powerful weapon in itself. Zathrians were used to dealing with species that adhered to predictable patterns. Humans, on the other hand, acted without warning, without rhyme or reason, and it drove the Zathrians to the brink of madness. Meanwhile, the public face of the human resistance remained largely invisible. They had learned the hard way not to rely on any one centralized organization, especially in a galaxy where betrayal was common. Instead, human leaders worked independently, small cells scattered across the galaxy, each operating with its own agenda, but united by the same cause: survival. At the same time, they continued to search for more allies, reaching out to species who had similarly suffered under the Zathrians' influence. The former slaves of the Aquari, a race of aquatic beings, were among the next to join the movement. Their intimate knowledge of subterranean and oceanic environments provided a significant advantage in attacking Zathrian strongholds that were otherwise impenetrable. The Zathrians, by now, had begun to realize they had underestimated humanity. Their psychic dominance had been their greatest weapon, and yet humans, lacking any innate psychic abilities, had found ways to shield themselves, to block their control. It was as if humanity's very nature was the antithesis of the Zathrians' hive-like mentality. Their inability to form mental connections made them immune to the Zathrians' psychic influence, forcing the invaders to resort to more traditional means of warfare. In one particularly daring operation, human forces managed to infiltrate the heart of a Zathrian psychic nexus, a powerful facility where the Zathrians enhanced their mental influence over other species. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by psychic dampening fields that neutralized the powers of any non-Zathrian species. Yet the humans didn't rely on brute force. Instead, they used their newfound understanding of Zathrian technology, their knowledge of the psyche, and the element of surprise. The operation was a success. The team not only destroyed the psychic nexus, but also acquired key data on the Zathrian mind control process, which was later reverse-engineered to develop human countermeasures. This was the turning point, the first true blow struck against the Zathrian forces. For the first time in months, humanity felt a glimmer of hope. But this victory came at a cost. The resistance had now become known to the Zathrians, and the invaders retaliated swiftly and violently. They began hunting down human colonies with renewed fervor, knowing that if they couldn't crush this movement, their conquest of the galaxy would never be complete. They unleashed their most terrifying weapons, advanced psychic agents capable of entering human minds with terrifying precision. As the resistance's momentum built, humanity understood the stakes were no longer about winning small battles. This was a war of survival, one that would define whether or not Earth's light would burn out in the cold void of space. But with each passing day, humanity grew bolder, more united, and more capable of meeting the Zathrians on their terms. The resistance was no longer just a group of desperate outliers. They were a force that could challenge the very fabric of galactic dominance. And the Zathrians were about to learn just how wrong they were about humanity. The first real breakthrough in humanity's struggle came not from the front lines, but from the research labs hidden deep within Earth's most secure military facilities. While the Zathrians' psychic powers had proven to be their greatest strength, humanity's most brilliant minds were beginning to realize that the key to defeating them lay in understanding the raw force of human emotions. It had all started with a simple hypothesis put forward by Dr. Ilara Voss, one of Earth's leading neuroscientists. During a covert meeting with military officials, Dr. Voss presented a radical idea. What if human emotions, fear, anger, love, desperation, were not weaknesses, but untapped reservoirs of energy? Could these emotions, often dismissed as unpredictable and irrational, be channeled into a weapon capable of countering the Zathrians' cold, calculated mind control? Her hypothesis was met with skepticism at first, but the escalating Zathrian threat left little room for doubt. Desperation turned into determination, and within a matter of weeks, a small secret research project began to take shape. Dr. Voss and her team began working with an array of human subjects, volunteers who were trained to manipulate their emotional states with precision. The goal was to see if intense emotion could be converted into an energy source powerful enough to disrupt the Zathrian psychic fields. What they discovered was nothing short of astounding. Through the use of cutting-edge neural amplifiers, they found that emotions could indeed be harnessed as raw energy. In particular, human fear and rage seemed to amplify the most. By feeding the energy produced by intense emotional states into a specially designed energy cannon, they managed to create an energy pulse that was capable of disrupting the psychic fields of even the most powerful Zathrian mind controllers. It was as if the concentrated force of human emotion acted as a kind of psychic shockwave, a disruptive force that shattered the Zathrians' ability to control or manipulate minds. The scientists dubbed the weapon the Soulfire. It was a fitting name, one that represented the very essence of humanity: raw, unpredictable, and full of potential. The first test of the Soulfire was a success beyond anyone's expectations. When a test subject, a former soldier named Jonah Pierce, released a burst of concentrated rage through the neural amplifier, the resulting energy pulse sent a shockwave through the lab, short-circuiting several Zathrian control devices they had acquired in previous operations. But the Soulfire wasn't just about disrupting Zathrian psychic powers. It was a weapon that tapped into something far deeper within humanity: the will to fight, to survive, and to protect what was theirs. It was a reminder that for all their technological advancements, the Zathrians had never understood the full potential of their enemies. The very thing they considered humanity's greatest flaw, our emotions, was, in fact, our greatest strength. Word of the Soulfire spread quickly among the resistance. It was a game-changer, and its impact was immediate. Small units of resistance fighters began using portable versions of the weapon, using bursts of concentrated emotion to destabilize Zathrian mind control centers, disrupt their communications, and even sabotage their warships. The Zathrians, who had once considered humanity a primitive species with no real potential for defense, now found themselves on the defensive. The emotional pulses of the Soulfire were like nothing they had ever encountered: untamed, chaotic, and lethal. But with this newfound power came new challenges. The Soulfire weapon was not without its risks. The emotional energy needed to power it was immense, and the strain it placed on human bodies was severe. Jonah Pierce, the first to use the weapon in combat, was nearly incapacitated after just a few uses, his mind and body left reeling from the intense emotional stress. Yet the human spirit, ever resilient, refused to back down. The weapon was refined, its systems improved, and more soldiers were trained in how to harness their emotions without losing control. The Zathrians, meanwhile, were scrambling to understand what was happening. The Soulfire weapon disrupted their entire strategic advantage. Their psychic commanders could no longer rely on subtlety or mind control to suppress humanity's willpower. The human resistance, once seen as an afterthought, was now a formidable threat. The Zathrians were forced to adapt, but for the first time in the war, they were on the back foot. The Zathrians' response was swift and brutal. They began launching targeted strikes on human colonies with the singular purpose of wiping out anyone who might possess knowledge of the Soulfire weapon. But the humans had learned from their earlier mistakes. They had become masters of mobility, striking quickly and retreating before the Zathrians could mount an effective counteroffensive. Humanity's new weapon allowed them to not only defend their worlds, but to push back. They began to retake colonies that had once fallen to the Zathrians, turning the tide in key battles. As the resistance gained momentum, the humans realized they were on the brink of something far larger than they had ever anticipated. This war, once thought to be a desperate struggle for survival, was becoming a fight to reshape the balance of power in the galaxy itself. With the Soulfire as their ultimate weapon, humanity was no longer just a species fighting for survival. They were becoming the harbingers of a new era, one where the underestimation of human potential would come to haunt the very species that had thought themselves untouchable. And the Zathrians would soon learn that, when it came to fighting for their future, humanity had only just begun. With the Zathrians now forced onto the defensive, humanity's newfound weapon, the Soulfire, began to turn the tide of the war. However, while the Zathrians struggled to adapt to the unexpected onslaught, they were not a species to be defeated easily. Their psychic abilities, though disrupted, still provided them with an edge over other races, and their dark intelligence network had begun to piece together a troubling truth. It wasn't just the Soulfire they had underestimated. It was humanity itself. Behind the scenes, the Zathrians had already begun to launch covert operations to counteract the human resistance. They had come to realize that the resistance was being fueled not only by technology and tactics, but by something more elusive: humanity's raw, unrelenting will to fight. To the Zathrians, who were accustomed to controlling everything with their psychic powers, this was an anomaly. They could manipulate minds, but they couldn't control this raw, uncontainable force. In the shadows of the galaxy, the Zathrians turned to their most dangerous weapon yet, an ancient order of psychic assassins known as the Viral. These beings were the Zathrians' most deadly creation, bred from their own species' genetic material, and augmented with centuries of psychic training. The Viral operated outside the traditional hierarchy of the Zathrian forces. They had no allegiance to the Council, nor to the hive-like collective mentality of their creators. They were free agents, trained to enter the minds of their targets and destroy them from within, turning their enemies into mindless husks. The Viral had been kept secret for millennia. Only the highest echelons of Zathrian society knew of their existence, and now they had been sent to Earth and to the Resistance's most critical strongholds to carry out a silent war. The Zathrians understood that while the Soulfire could disrupt their psychic command centers, it could not stop the Viral. These assassins could slip past any shield, enter any mind, and shut down any leader. The only way to defeat the Resistance was to sever its backbone, to destroy the humans who had rallied the galaxy to their cause. While the Zathrians plotted in the shadows, Ambassador Hayes found himself increasingly frustrated with the Galactic Council's refusal to act decisively. The Council had grown concerned about the humans' growing influence, and though they had been forced to acknowledge the Zathrians' threat, they still considered humanity's power as something to be contained, not supported. They viewed the human resistance as a potential threat to their own dominance, believing that if humanity became too powerful, they would challenge the delicate balance of power within the galaxy. Despite the Council's reluctance to act, Hayes knew that humanity could not afford to wait any longer. The humans needed more than just a weapon. They needed allies. They needed to bring the galaxy to its senses and unite against the Zathrians before they could regroup and strike back with their full force. So, behind closed doors, Hayes began to form a new coalition, one that would unite species who had previously been ignored or oppressed by the Council, species like the Vecnari and the Aquari, who had fought their own battles but were now ready to join forces against a common enemy. But even as the new alliance began to take shape, disaster struck. The first sign that something had gone horribly wrong came from a small human colony on the edge of Council space, a research outpost called Triton 5. The colony had been one of the first to fall under the protection of the Resistance. They had set up a defensive perimeter and were conducting research into countermeasures for the Zathrians' psychic powers. But when a distress signal came through, faint and barely coherent, it wasn't the Zathrians they were warning of. It was something far worse. By the time a human rescue team arrived at Triton 5, the entire colony had been wiped out. There were no bodies, no signs of battle, and no traces of destruction. The base's communication systems had been completely fried, and the only remaining evidence of what had happened was a single, chilling message sent from one of the research labs. It was a series of fragmented words, barely intelligible, but there was one word that stood out among the rest. Viral. Hayes and his team quickly realized what had happened. The Viral, the psychic assassins of the Zathrians, had infiltrated the human ranks, targeting not just the Resistance's leaders, but the very foundations of their support. The Zathrians had realized that even with the Soulfire, the greatest threat to their domination wasn't just humanity's ability to fight, it was humanity's unity. The Resistance could not stand if its heart was torn apart from within. The revelation was a devastating blow to the human Resistance, but it also solidified the resolve of those who had joined the fight. The Viral were a terrifying adversary, but they were also proof of something humanity had known all along. They were not fighting for their survival alone. The Resistance was more than just a group of soldiers, more than just a weapon. They were a symbol. The galaxy had watched as humanity rose from the ashes of war and oppression, and now, in the face of unimaginable odds, they would rise again. Ambassador Hayes called for a meeting with his closest allies, the leaders of the Vecneri, the Aquari, and the human military commanders. The time had come to act. The Viral may have come to destroy them from within, but humanity had faced worse threats before, and now, with their resolve hardened and their unity stronger than ever, they were ready to strike back. The war was no longer about survival. It was about something greater. It was about reclaiming the future and showing the galaxy that humanity would never back down. The Zathrians had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the heart of humanity. And that was something they would regret. The loss of Triton 5 was a stark reminder of how far the Zathrians were willing to go. The Viral were not just assassins. They were executioners of the mind. Each of them was capable of slipping into a human's consciousness with such precision that even the most experienced Resistance fighters were left vulnerable. Their arrival was like a shadow across the battlefield, invisible, unstoppable, and utterly devastating. Ambassador Hayes, despite the crushing loss, had a singular focus. Humanity could not allow this assault to break their spirit. If the Viral had infiltrated the ranks of the Resistance, it was only a matter of time before they would strike against the most important leaders and thinkers in the fight for survival. But the human response was not one of fear or retreat. It was a rallying cry for unity, for ingenuity, and most of all, for the resilience of humanity's heart. Hayes knew the next step was to outthink the Viral. The psychic assassins were capable of infiltrating the mind, of manipulating perception, but they were not invulnerable. They could be detected, trapped, and neutralized if they could be forced into the open. The Resistance's best minds turned their attention to a single objective: creating a psychic shield powerful enough to detect and block the Viril's influence. The best candidates for this operation were the humans themselves, whose emotional energy had already proven capable of disrupting Zathrian psychic fields. Now the goal was to develop a shield that could disrupt the Viril's deep penetration into the human psyche before they could execute their silent kill. Dr. Ilara Voss and her team began working on what they called the Aegis Protocol. Using a combination of neural enhancing technology, modified Soulfire energy systems, and human emotional amplification, they sought to create a personal, deployable shield, a psychic barrier that would send a wave of emotional energy strong enough to sever the Viril's connection to their targets. But there was a catch. The Aegis Protocol wasn't perfect. It required immense focus and energy from the person generating the shield, and even then, the shield's effectiveness was limited. For it to work, the user had to maintain intense emotional focus, something that would be difficult in the middle of battle, when fear and chaos threatened to overwhelm the mind. Furthermore, The shield could only last for a short period of time before it needed to recharge. Despite the risks, Hayes gave the green light to deploy the Aegis Protocol across the Resistance's most crucial cells. He knew that the Virel would not stop until they had extinguished every last flicker of hope from the human rebellion. If humanity was going to survive, they had to face their enemy head-on, even if that meant walking straight into the lion's den. The first major test of the Aegis Protocol came during a high-stakes operation to reclaim a strategic stronghold on the planet of Rover. The stronghold had been a key supply base for the Resistance and had recently fallen into Zathrian hands. It was also one of the last remaining pieces of human territory, near the heart of Zathrian-controlled space. The Virel were known to be operating in the area, and Hayes feared that the assault would end in disaster unless the Resistance had a fighting chance against their invisible killers. A small elite unit, made up of humans and their closest allies, the Vecneri and Aquari, was sent in to retrieve the stronghold. Among them was Jonah Pierce, the first human to wield the Soulfire, and a seasoned warrior, though still bearing the physical and emotional scars of his earlier battles. He volunteered to be the first test subject for the Aegis Protocol, knowing full well the risks. The mission was brutal. The Virel had already infiltrated the planet, and the Resistance squad found themselves facing an invisible enemy. The battle was chaotic, as one by one, their comrades began to fall under the silent assault of the Virel, their minds hijacked and their wills shattered. Without warning, the Resistance soldiers would drop, their faces blank, their actions robotic as they turned against their own. Jonah, now equipped with the Aegis Protocol, was the last line of defense. He focused every ounce of his remaining energy, drawing upon the rage and desperation of years of fighting for survival. His shield flared to life, and for the first time in the mission, the invisible enemy was visible, a flicker of psychic energy that shimmered in the air like a distorted mirage. The Virel were no longer ghosts in the machine. The Aegis Protocol illuminated them in a violent burst of energy, shattering their ability to influence the minds of the Resistance. With the Virel temporarily exposed, Jonah was able to retaliate, using the Soulfire in tandem with his emotional focus to disrupt the Virel's control. In a series of coordinated strikes, the human squad disabled the psychic assassins, turning the tide of the battle. It was a hard-won victory, but it came at a significant cost. Jonah Pierce was critically injured, his body drained from the immense mental strain of using both the Aegis Protocol and the Soulfire in tandem. But as the smoke cleared on Rovar's war-torn surface, humanity had made a statement. They would not be defeated. The Zathrians, now aware of humanity's resilience and the threat posed by the Aegis Protocol, would no longer have the advantage of surprise. The battle was far from over, but the humans had learned something crucial. The Zathrians could break their bodies, they could infiltrate their minds, but they could never break their spirit. And as long as that spirit remained, humanity would keep fighting. The victory at Rover was a turning point, but it was also a grim reminder of just how much humanity had sacrificed to get this far. Jonah Pierce, though alive, was severely injured, his body and mind taxed by the strain of wielding both the Soulfire and the Aegis Protocol. The human Resistance now knew that while they had a chance to push back the Zathrians and their deadly assassins, every battle would come with a heavy toll. Still, the victory was a signal to the galaxy that humanity's spirit was unyielding. As the Resistance regrouped and tended to its wounded, Ambassador Hayes focused on the broader picture. The Zathrians were not going to let a few setbacks derail their plan to conquer humanity and the galaxy. It was clear they had underestimated the ingenuity and will of humankind, but they would learn quickly. Hayes knew that the Resistance could not afford to remain reactive, merely defending their homeworlds and strongholds. They needed to take the fight to the Zathrians, to make them feel the full weight of humanity's wrath. With the development of the Aegis Protocol and the success of the Soulfire weapon, the Resistance now had the tools to challenge the Zathrians on their own terms. But what the humans didn't yet have was the element of surprise. The The Zathrians were now aware of the threat humanity posed, and they would be preparing for the inevitable counterattack. The time had come for humanity to strike where it would hurt the most. Hayes knew the Zathrians' most critical asset was their flagship, the Zerinthar, a massive dreadnought that served as their command center and the heart of their operations. It was a symbol of their dominance, a fortress in space that had never been breached. The Zerinthar was equipped with weapons capable of obliterating entire fleets, and its psychic defenses made it nearly impossible for even the most advanced technologies to penetrate. To destroy it would send a message. Humanity would not just survive. They would thrive. But attacking the Zerinthar was no easy feat. The dreadnought was heavily guarded, surrounded by fleets of Zathrian warships, and protected by psychic barriers that would make it nearly impossible to approach unnoticed. If the resistance was to have any hope of defeating it, they would need to strike with overwhelming force, surprise, and precision. It was a risky move, and not everyone in the resistance was convinced it was the right one. Some feared that such an assault would be nothing more than a suicide mission, a doomed attempt to defeat a foe far too powerful. But Hayes, ever the strategist, knew that the time for hesitation was over. They had to show the galaxy that humanity would not back down, that their strength and will to fight could not be crushed by Zathrian oppression. To execute the plan, Hayes called upon his most trusted allies, the Vecnari, whose advanced tactical knowledge and expertise in stealth warfare would be crucial to bypassing the Zathrians' defenses, and the Aquari, whose unique abilities to manipulate underwater environments would play a critical role in executing a covert strike against the Zerinthar's external hull. The plan was risky, but it was the only option left to turn the tide in humanity's favor. The operation was named Project Eclipse, a final, decisive strike that would force the Zathrians to confront the humans not just as a rebellious species, but as a threat to the entire balance of power in the galaxy. It would be a mission of audacity and precision, where failure would mean the end of everything humanity had fought for. As the final preparations for the assault began, a strange sense of unity swept through the resistance. The people of Earth, once divided and broken, were now an unstoppable force. The Galactic Council, seeing the resolve of humanity, begrudgingly pledged their support, offering intelligence and resources. The Aquari and the Vecnari readied their fleets, and human forces began assembling at key rally points across the galaxy. Before they set out, Hayes addressed his forces, standing before the gathered troops and allies, his voice firm and resolute. Today, we fight not just for Earth, not just for our families, but for the future of every species that dreams of freedom. We will show the Zathrians what they should have known all along. Humanity will never kneel. With the fleets in place and the final details of the assault worked out, the operation commenced. The Zathrians, though still recovering from the earlier blows, were caught off guard by the sudden movement of human forces. Their fleets were spread thin, divided in their efforts to maintain control of occupied worlds and respond to the rising tide of rebellion. The first phase of the attack was a feint. Human forces engaged Zathrian fleets in a series of simulated battles that drew the enemy's attention away from their flagship. The Vecnari, using their stealth technology and adaptive combat strategies, infiltrated key Zathrian defense systems, sabotaging their communication channels and disrupting their psychic relay stations. Meanwhile, the Aquari led a team of engineers and demolition experts to breach the Zerinthar's outer hull, something that had never been attempted before. The aquatic race's ability to navigate underwater environments proved crucial as they bypassed the Zathrians' surface-level defenses, planting explosive charges along critical points of the dreadnought. With the Zathrians unaware of the true nature of the assault, humanity's strike force launched its final phase. A fleet of human warships, under the command of seasoned commanders, moved in fast and hard, bombarding the Zerinthar with a concentrated barrage of soulfire-infused weaponry, destabilizing its psychic shields. This was the moment when the Zathrians realized just how wrong they had been about humanity. The battle for the Zerinthar was on, And with it, humanity's reckoning had begun. The Zarenthar shuddered as the first wave of soul fire-infused strikes hit its outer shields, rippling through the psychic defenses like a crack in an unshakable fortress. The Zathrian dreadnought, once an impregnable symbol of their dominance, groaned under the weight of human fury. For the first time in the war, the Zathrians were forced to face the unthinkable. The enemy they had long dismissed as weak and unworthy of notice was now dismantling their greatest weapon. On board the human flagship, Pride of Earth, Ambassador Hayes stood at the command center, watching the chaos unfold. His face was a mask of resolve. Every second of the assault was crucial. Every move had to be precise. The Zathrians might be reeling, but they were far from defeated. The battle was only beginning. "Keep up the pressure," Hayes commanded, his voice steady. "Target the weak points we identified. Keep the momentum. We have to crack their core systems before they can regroup." Captain Maria Jensen, one of the most decorated leaders of the human resistance, stood by his side. She had led dozens of operations, but this was different. This was the assault on the heart of Zathrian power. Her hands hovered over the controls as she directed the fleet's fire. The Pride of Earth and the supporting ships sent wave after wave of energy, each blast from the soul fire-infused cannons raking across the Zarenthar's armor. But the Zathrians were far from helpless. As the shields buckled and the weapon systems faltered, their psychic commanders rallied, quickly adjusting their strategy. From within the Zarenthar, the Zathrian leader, Commander Taurix, had already initiated their counterattack. His mind was a vortex of psychic power, and he used it to rally his forces. He had underestimated humanity's raw strength, but he would not make that mistake again. "Activate the countermeasures," Taurix ordered, his voice a cold, commanding presence within the dreadnought. "We will not allow this species to bring us down. Activate the psychic disruptors and deploy the Viral." The Viral, though severely weakened from their earlier exposure, were deployed in a last-ditch effort to secure the Zathrian flagship. The assassins slipped through the psychic noise created by the clash of energy and mind, infiltrating the human forces with a new sense of urgency. Jonah Pierce, despite his injuries, had joined the front line of the human assault. His role was crucial. He was the last line of defense against the Zathrians' psychic onslaught. The Aegis Protocol was in full swing, his emotional energy sparking a protective barrier around the resistance forces, keeping the Viral at bay. But even with the shield, Jonah knew this would be the hardest fight of his life. The Zathrians were pulling out all the stops, and there was no turning back. As the battle raged, the Pride of Earth broke through the Zathrian defenses. The final push had begun. Hayes knew that the Zarenthar's core was vulnerable now. Its psychic relay systems were faltering, its communication networks were down, and its weapon systems had been damaged. It was time to strike. "We're in range," Captain Jensen called, her voice tight with focus. "Preparing the Soulfire torpedo." "This is it." Hayes turned to face her, a fire in his eyes. "Launch it. Do it now." With a thunderous roar, the Pride of Earth launched its most devastating weapon, a torpedo laced with Soulfire energy. It sped through the vast emptiness of space, its trajectory aimed straight for the Zarenthar's heart. For a moment, it seemed like the galaxy held its breath. Then, the torpedo collided with the core of the Zathrian dreadnought. The resulting explosion was like nothing the Resistance had ever seen. The Zarenthar erupted in a burst of fire and energy, its massive structure breaking apart. The blast was so intense that it sent shockwaves across the battlefield, destabilizing the remaining Zathrian fleets and leaving them disoriented. But there was no time to savor the victory. There was still work to be done. As the Zarenthar crumbled, Talrix's voice boomed across the bridge of the Pride of Earth. "This is not the end." He spat, his voice filled with rage and fear. "You cannot win. We will rise again." Hayes's gaze remained fixed on the disintegrating flagship. "You've already lost, Talrix," he said softly, though the weight of his words was heavy. "You underestimated humanity. and that was your mistake. As the last remnants of the Zerinthar disappeared into the void, the Zathrian fleets began to retreat, their morale shattered, their resolve broken. Humanity had proven that they could fight back against the most insurmountable odds, and in doing so, had shattered the myth of Zathrian invincibility. The Resistance had not just won a battle, they had won the war. For the first time in the history of the galaxy, the Zathrians had been humbled, their forces scattered, their leadership in disarray, and their sense of superiority destroyed. The galaxy, once at the mercy of the Zathrian Empire, was now poised to look toward a future of freedom. As Hayes stood on the command deck of the Pride of Earth, he knew this was not the end of humanity's journey. It was only the beginning. The Resistance had not just fought for their survival. They had fought for the freedom of every species, every world, and every future yet to be written. Humanity had won, not because of their technology, not because of their weapons, but because they had something the Zathrians would never understand, a heart that would never stop fighting. The galaxy was theirs to rebuild, and they would do so with the knowledge that no force, no matter how powerful, could ever silence the spirit of humankind. And that, in the end, was humanity's greatest weapon.